they had an international council to redivide Europe and to put a king back on, the throne in France, and they created the United Kingdom of the Netherlands. And one of the interesting parts of this is that this part of the world of Europe is called the Low Countries. And it's called the Low Countries because the area, the land is actually, much of it is below sea level. So what we see on the map is actually today 3 different countries. We have the Netherlands, the provinces of the Netherlands to the north. We have Belgium in the center. And then in the lower right, we have Luxembourg. So we'll be talking about the Netherlands and Belgium. So the fact that this is the low country, it's because so much of the land is underwater, below sea level, often by 6 to 9 feet. And we know water will go to the lowest level, and that can cause a lot of flooding. But this has occurred for hundreds of thousands of years in the Netherlands. And it's part of their DNA, it's part of their history and culture. And there's a legend in the Netherlands called the Dyke legend. And the legend is that thousands of years ago, tens of thousands of years ago, there was a devastating breach of flooding. And after 3 or 4 days of loss of life and land, the people that survived, they looked out on the water, and what did they see but a cradle with a child and a cat that was rocking the cradle to prevent it from tipping over. And so here we have a child that lived. And the legend, whether it's true or not, really no one knows. But it speaks to the fact that this is a people that will survive and that will adapt to the fact that their water is part of their heritage and part of the reality. So just a little history, because I think the history here will say a lot about what we see when we go to the Netherlands today. So back in 1516, the Netherlands in this region was actually part under the control of Spain. And King Charles I of Spain ruled the Netherlands. I'm just there. The King Charles I of Spain ruled the Netherlands, but there was growing unrest among a population that was becoming more and more Protestant and causing a disconnect between the king and the people. There was already some dissatisfaction that here they had a country, a region that was controlled by faraway Spain, but with the growing Protestant population, there was even a further disconnect. This occurred in 1568. The Netherlands and the regions of Amsterdam started a war of independence. And it lasted 80 years. And it wasn't a constant battles taking place year after year. There were some decades when there was barely any battles at all. But other decades, there were some significant battles. But after the 80 years, the Netherlands did achieve their freedom. But one of the things that took place, and one of the guides of our trip told us that on a specific Sunday, that the leaders of Amsterdam decided that on a specific Sunday, they were going to switch from being largely a Catholic city to a Protestant city. And so that all the churches converted over to the Protestant model. And part of that model, there was lots of models in terms of preaching and having the Bible in the native language, but there was also a change in the look of the church. So all the statues were removed, the artwork was removed, the walls were painted white. So, and even to this day, if you visit one of the major churches, you see this austere interior. Now, it also had an impact for the artists, because the artists had a lot of their money came from doing church art. And that work went away. What also took place is that the Protestant leaders now said to those that wanted to remain Catholic, they said, you're able to remain Catholic, that's fine, but you can't have a church. But you can meet and have mass, but you have to do it pretty privately. Maybe you do it at a warehouse or at some hall where you don't advertise it, but your members can go there and practice Catholicism. There was not the bloodshed that had occurred in Germany or in parts of France, but there was years of distrust between the Protestants and the Catholics. And actually, we could almost say there was 400 years of limited trust. So also taking place in the 1600s, Netherlands became a world leader in trade, and they discovered the Spice Islands, which we know as Indonesia, and the ships from the Netherlands would go over to the Spice Islands and bring back the spices and the wonderful food and spices from the Far East. And what we see here on the picture on the left is a painting that shows a ship, a Dutch ship or Holland ship, leaving for the Netherlands. And that ship will be gone for at least 2 years on the journey, because they had to go down around Africa and all the way across the Indian Ocean. 2-year trip, and a third of the ships never came back. And so you could picture the people leaving, and either their family members or sailors or officers, a sad farewell. And here we have on the right is that same spot, that same tower that still is there in Amsterdam, 400 years later. And I did crop out the modern building to the right, but basically much of Amsterdam is the exact same as it was 400 years ago. Now, Amsterdam, with the independence in the merchants and the trade, it was really a merchant-centered environment. And so they had princes and administrators, but the merchants largely controlled the politics and the priorities in Amsterdam and in the Netherlands. And here we have a painting by Rembrandt called The Night Watch. And this is a huge painting, 12 feet by 14 feet. And it was actually even larger until it had to be cut back for some previous location. And the merchants actually paid to have their face shown in the painting. And so we have this guy in the center, he is the leader, and to his left is a lieutenant. And the other people are standing around behind the leader, and everyone apparently paid the same amount of money. And at this point, the night watch, they have their rifles, but 30 years earlier, they might have actually used the rifles to defend the city. But now it was more of a men's club and a drinking club rather than actually having to fight, but they still got together to celebrate their time together. So they're also interesting, in the middle of that painting, you see a young woman, and she actually has a chicken on her belt. And art historians debate, what does that really mean? One group of historians think that the woman there is actually painting the face of Rembrandt's wife. So that little bit of art. Mir. Okay, now here we have, this shows in 1637, tulips were very popular in the Netherlands. And they came from Turkey apparently initially, but they became hugely popular. And unique tulip bulbs became very popular in this year, such that what might have been a $10 tulip bulb was selling for $2,000 and $3,000 and $5,000 and $10,000, because everyone would buy that bulb thinking somebody's going to pay even more the next day. Well, this went on for quite a while, but as typically happens, eventually it all came crashing down and the bulbs were worthless. And this is portrayed in a PBS series called The Miniaturist that was on Channel 11 a few years ago, and it's probably available on Netflix or perhaps even from the library. But it's a wonderful series because it shows what life was like in the Netherlands in this time period. And it's a very, very realistic portrayal. And it was made possible because they could use the set within Amsterdam that looks exactly like it did 400 years ago. But it's a wonderful series. Also taking place in the 16 and 1700s, the Dutch gained their independence, Netherlands independence. They had wars with England and France. So England was somewhat of a rivalry for trade, but and they did have some battles with England, but through it all, they continued to be very active traders around the world. Now, also what took place as we move into the 1800s, the southern provinces of the Netherlands had remained largely Catholic. And they felt not totally part of the Netherlands, and they felt they weren't getting the great jobs. And they decided they wanted to have their own country. And so the southern provinces revolted. And after about 10 years, the Netherlands, or the northern provinces of what was that united country, they said, fine, go create your own country. And Belgium decided they wanted to have a parliamentary democracy that looked like England, where they would have a king, but they would have a constitution and a parliament. And they needed to have a king. So they searched around and they selected a guy that became King Leopold. And this was actually, if we remember the TV series of Victoria and Albert on Channel 11, this was actually Uncle Leopold, the uncle to Prince Albert. And by all reckonings, he was a pretty good king, and he did a nice job. However, his son, who ruled for over 40 years, was Leopold II. And he is viewed now as one of the evil men of history, because he looked around and he saw that England had colonies and France had colonies, even Germany had some colonies, but little Belgium did not. And so he paid some explorers to go into deep Africa to find some land that had not been claimed by anyone else. And the land that he finally took possession of is the Congo. And it was called the Congo Free State. And he personally owned it. Belgium did not own it. King Leopold owned it. And he was a ruthless ruler. And if you were a worker in the sugarcane field and you didn't meet your quota, you would have your arm chopped off. And it's estimated that 10 to 15 million Africans died under his rule. So a very sad period for humanity. In the 20th century, the Netherlands were neutral in World War I, and they were occupied by the German army in World War II, where Belgium was devastated twice, both World War I and World War II. And the Netherlands in World War II, the biggest tragedies were the Jews that were removed and sent to death camps, including Anne Frank, and the Anne Frank house is in Amsterdam. And then also the starvation of the Netherlands people, that the Germans took so much food to East that many, particularly towards the end of the war, many people were starving when the Allies finally freed the Netherlands. The one battle that took place, or the major battle that took place, was in Arnhem in the Netherlands, when the British Army dropped paratroopers in to capture this bridge over the Rhine River. And this is covered in the movie A Bridge Too Far. And it was, by historians, it was a needless tragedy, because the Netherlands resistance told the British that there were German tank divisions near this area. And the British discounted that, and they were eager to use their paratroopers. So they sent the paratroopers in, and they were quickly surrounded by the Germans. And there was great loss of life among the British, and many soldiers captured and many others died. And a few were able to get out, but it was one of the tragedies of World War II. Now, when Mary and I were there in 2019, and this was the 350th anniversary of the death of Rembrandt, and here we see Rembrandt on as a self-portrait as a young man on the upper left, and as an older man in the lower left. And clearly, he was seeking for realism and not trying to flatter his look as an older man. And in the upper right, we see that portrait, that painting that I referred to earlier of the Night Watch. And in the context of the people standing in front of it, you see how huge this painting is. So in 2019, it was a major Rembrandt year in celebration. And to say a few words about art, Rembrandt is known for many, many paintings. And he was one of the few Protestant painters that did biblical art and did it quite successfully. And here we have the famous painting of the prodigal son that was from 1667. But one of the art historians that I listened to spent more time talking about this painting. And this is Bathsheba at her bath. And the art historian talked about Rembrandt as such an empathetic painter of women. And here we have a sensual and empathetic look at Bathsheba. And the biblical story of Bathsheba is that she was bathing one day, and King David saw her and said, she was at her roof, and he was up in one of his towers, and he lusted after Bathsheba. And in this painting, Bathsheba is holding a piece of paper that is actually an invitation from King David to come to the royal palace tonight alone. But the look on her face says, this is not going to end well. You know, when the king asks you to come alone to the palace at night, that this is not going to have a happy ending, as indeed it did not. So Bathsheba's husband was actually a senior officer in the Israeli army, and King David sent a letter to the general, the senior general, saying, put Bathsheba's husband at the front line to let him be killed. And indeed he was, and King David married Bathsheba. So this was, Rembrandt's art says it all in this particular painting. Now, we actually are taking we're kind of moving away from history, and want to cover the trip that we took, which was actually a river cruise, a Viking river cruise. But our journey begins in Amsterdam, where we flew into. And the beauty of Amsterdam is the vast majority of central Amsterdam is exactly as it was 400 years ago. Here, it's a city of canals. And we're looking here, this is the second building here was actually where Rembrandt was one of his apartments. And as we stand here and look at this, this is exactly what Rembrandt would have seen 400 years ago, minus the lights on the canals, on the bridge. But these were the exact same bridges that were there 400 years ago. But Mary and I arrived actually a couple days early, and we went to some of the local museums. But we finally boarded our ship, which was the Viking Gefla. And this was a wonderful ship. It's 180 passengers, a crew of 40. And the ship is designed to fit right within the locks for the rivers and the canals around this region. So a canal, when the boat moves into a lock, you can actually have two ships side by side, and then you can have two ships behind those two ships, so that 4 of these ships can go up or down with the locks opening the water to raise or lower the ship. So here we have most, we know with 180 people, after a day or two, you basically meet most of the people on the ship. And very quickly, we met this group that is sitting at the table with us. And Mary and I are on the left side, on the far side. And on the left side, closest to the camera, is a husband and wife. She was actually a minister, a retired pastor of a Moldavian church in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. And on the right side, on the far side, is a retired Air Force colonel and his wife. And closest on the right is Bob and Marge. And Bob was our leader. So after we got to know these people, every time, Bob would arrange for us to have a table together. And usually on a Viking ship, on any of these river cruises, you're busy all day. But usually you're back on the ship and they might have a lecture at 6 o'clock talking about what's going to take place the next day. And then dinner is at 7. And everyone eats dinner at the same time. There's no different meal times. And Bob would always leave the lecture 10 minutes early to go down and get a table so that we had a table when the other 7 of us arrived. And he was a retired art professor from Louisiana Tech University in Louisiana. So the first full day on the ship, we actually got on a smaller boat and we took a canal boat tour. So here's Mary and I on the right, and here we have the Amsterdam on the left. And I was surprised. Amsterdam has wide canals, and then they have some narrow canals, all interconnected. And here we are on the left picture here. We're going under this bridge, and the boat we are on is actually quite low. It did not have a tall superstructure. So we could actually go under that bridge without the bridge opening. However, if it was a taller ship or a sailboat, this bridge could very easily open because if you look at the bridge at the top, they have a counterweight on the far left and right side. And so somebody could pull a rope and maybe with 10 pounds worth of pulling, that bridge will open up. So that so you have to have a person on each side pulling to open the bridge, but very ingenious the way that's designed. On the right, we see some of the boats along the side of the canal. And people actually live in these boats, and they pay rent to the city of Amsterdam, where they have electricity and water and sewage all supplied. But every couple of years, they have to prove that the boat is still seaworthy and it won't sink. But that's an option people that want to live on the water. And here we see a couple of very nice boats that people live in. And what we see here is these are today apartments and office buildings, but in the 1700s, these were some of the 1,000 warehouses that existed within Amsterdam. And if you look at the top, like that building on that left, it looks like a dark blue or purple. If you notice on the top, it looks like a rail is sticking out from the building. And that's there by design, and almost every of these types of buildings have it. And that would allow for them to have a pulley to pull up the merchandise to move it into the second or third floor of the warehouse. And so a ship that came from Indonesia, for example, might drop off a certain type of spice into this building and a different spice to another building. And then eventually it would be loaded onto smaller ships going to different parts of Europe. So Amsterdam was a hub and a transfer point for ships all throughout Northern Europe. And here on the left, our captain of our little boat stopped so we could get a picture of the 7 bridges. We see the bridge right in front of us, and then we see a second one. There's actually 7 bridges in a row that going down this canal. On the right, we see bicycles are everywhere within Amsterdam. And even today, Amsterdam is a working port. So these river boats can go up and down the Rhine and then cross over to the Danube. And they could be taking things that arrived from America and loaded onto these boats and these cargo vessels and sent throughout Germany, Austria, Eastern Europe, even as far as the Black Sea, all interconnected. Amsterdam is a city where it's a city built for bicycles. And on the picture on the right, they at the train station, this is one of 4 bike parking areas where there might be 10,000 bikes or more that people store here. And you might live 30 miles away, you take the train into Amsterdam, you pick up your bike and you drive to work or school. And people think nothing of it. It's a city, they discourage automobiles by taxing them and restricting where you can go with your automobile. The picture on the left, it shows a mom with a couple kids, and the kids are sitting in this wooden basket that's part of the bike. And they might be coming from or going to shopping for food. On a school day, the mom might be driving those kids to school. And that's rain or snow, people take their bike. It's a bike, as we see there on the left, bikes are all over. There's Mary with the beautiful tulips. And this was a trip that we took place. We arrived in Amsterdam on March, I think it was March 28th. And we got on the ship on March 30th. Here's some of the many museums in Amsterdam. The center one is the Rijksmuseum that is fine art and much of Rembrandt. And then there's wonderful separate museums for modern art, for Van Gogh. And the Anne Frank house is also quite near here. Our third day, and here we are on the ship, and the Viking ship, we actually took the ship only 30 miles north to visit a town called Hoorn. And until 1930s, this was actually had direct access to the North Sea. So Hoorn was an international port, and the Dutch East Indies Company would actually send ships from here that might go around South America or go around Africa to the Far East. So what we see here in that picture is a former warehouse that's now apartments, but this was part of the Dutch East Indies Company. And in the 1930s, they created a dike that blocked off access to the North Sea. So this added thousands of acres of farmland, and the water there actually turned from salt water to fresh water over a number of years. But it added to the farming land, which was very, very important to the Netherlands. So it became an inland lake town rather than an international seaport. Here we see the picture is of the cheese exchange. So this is an area famous for tulips and for cheese. And so the farmer could bring their cheese here in the 1800s, and it would be graded, and then it could be distributed, sent to either around the world, perhaps to England or Scotland, or sent over to Amsterdam, where it might be put on a boat to go to other parts of Europe. But one of the interesting things, this area, counting the town of Hoorn and the surrounding farmland, might have a population in the 1970s of 30,000 people. However, until 1975, they had a separate school and a hospital. They had one hospital and school for Protestants, one for Catholics, and one for all others. So there's this trust that occurred even back 300 years earlier. It was still somewhat present. And by 1975, they decided, we really should have one big school rather than 3 separate schools and one larger modern hospital. But this was 400 years in the making. We took two trips, two tours that day. One was to a farm that grew potatoes, and they actually had a modern windmill that created electricity. And they grew potatoes for French fries. So as part of the Viking program, the host had to have a little, a room like a classroom that people could come in and they could tell their story and then take us on a little tour of their farm. The second the second farm that we went to that same day was to a tulip farm. And here we have the farmer's wife gave us the little lecture in the classroom and then took us out to the warehouse where they prepared the tulips and then they processed them before they shipped them out, and told us the story of their family as a tulip farmer. And it was interesting because both of these farmers, the wife said, "I'm a farmer's wife." And I thought that was interesting because I think in the US, if the wife is active in the farm, they'd say, "I'm a farmer." It's not I'm just the farmer's wife. I'm the farmer. But here they made a very clear distinction that I'm the farmer's wife. I'm not the farmer. But that was a little tidbit. One of the interesting things she told us is that during the growing season for tulips, that a big semi-trailer truck would come at midnight and pick up thousands of their tulips and take them to the tulip auction in Amsterdam. And this is the largest tulip auction in the world. And what we see here on the right is the people, the hundreds of people that are around in this semicircle. These are the buyers for tulips. And when they bring, they might roll out 4 of these large tulip trays that contain thousands of tulips, and then they do what they call a Dutch auction. And in a normal auction, or the typical auction that we see here, is you start low and then you go higher and higher until somebody makes the highest bid. The Dutch auction actually begins the opposite way. It starts relatively high, and then every 5 seconds, they start lowering the price. So if you wait 10 or 15 seconds, you will have a lower price. However, if you wait too long, somebody will hit their button and buy that, and you wind up with no tulips. So so it becomes a game of guessing, what will the low price go to, and when do you jump in to make your commitment? Because once you press that button, you own those tulips. But what the farmer's wife explained is the tulips that are picked up at midnight, they're auctioned off at 8 or 9 o'clock the next morning, and they could be in Vienna or Berlin the following morning. So it's a very quick time from farm to tulip stand in the final destination. So the next day, so day 4 of our trip, we went actually on the boat to Antwerp, Belgium. And this is actually the second largest seaport in Europe. Rotterdam is the number 1, which is in the Netherlands. So Antwerp is number 2. And this is the home of Peter Paul Rubens. And it was known for, and is known even today for diamonds and chocolate. And during World War II, when the D-Day landing in 1944, the Allies would have loved to be able to move the ships into Antwerp to unload the supplies, but they knew that the Germans would destroy the seaport, and so the Allies had to land and offload ships down on the coast of Normandy and move it overland to where the troops were. But the inland ports were no longer available for several years until they were repaired. But here we have Peter Paul Rubens, and he lived about the same time as Rembrandt did, who was up in Amsterdam. And here's our guide on our right, and wonderful guides. All the guides we had were just very, very helpful. And he had a little radio system So a little transmitter. So we had earphones that we had so that we could hear him without having to shout. And even if there was a background noise, we could still hear the tour very nicely. The picture on the left, our guide explained, this was a palace in bygone years. And after there was no longer a need for a palace, it became a prison. And now they're trying to convert it back into a palace to make it a tourist attraction. So try to put it back into its palace stage. Our guide also explained that Belgium and Antwerp were a very Catholic town. And so in the 1700s and 1800s, if you put a statue of the Virgin Mary and a blue light on your front door, you got a drastic reduction in your taxes. And so it was a very, being religious was very advantageous from a taxing point of view. He took us to the cathedral, and this is a painting of Rembrandt of his raising of the cross. And we were standing like 15 feet. This is a huge, first of all, a huge painting. So it's a trifold that actually opens up so that it can actually close, that protects the painting. But this had to be 15 feet high by 24 feet wide. It was just and we were standing really 20 feet in front of it, just a short railing in between us and the painting. And it's nice to see a painting up close. Not only up close, but in the venue that it was designed for. So seeing that this was designed to be at this location, and that's very different than seeing it at a museum. You really get to see the whole context. Rembrandt, or actually Rubens, had a very nice business style as well. So if you wanted him to paint a picture, perhaps for if you were a rich merchant and you want a painting of your family, he'd come and you'd explain what you wanted, and then he'd do a little pencil sketch, and he might say, well, this is going to cost $10,000. And if he showed you the pencil sketch and you say, yes, this is what I want, and you paid 1/3 of the money. And then a month later, he'd come back with a painting, a small painting of 14 inch by 14 inch that represented what you wanted. And you might look at this, or the merchant might look at this and said, well, could you add our dog into the painting? And you'd say, and Rubens, would say, fine, that'll be a little extra money, but we'll add the dog. And then you paid another 1/3 of the fee. And then he finally brought the large painting, which might be 3 feet by 2 feet or larger, and he'd bring that to you. And at this point, the merchant would not be able to say, well, this is not what I expected, because it's exactly what was portrayed in that middle-sized painting that he brought you in color. And so there was no basis to dispute the agreement, and you took your painting and paid him the final installment. But in what we see here this is on a pillar of the church, we actually see a middle-size rendering of the artwork that's actually on the ceiling of the church. So this was that 14-inch by 14-inch version of what was going to become the much larger version. In Antwerp, beautiful chocolate, and our guide was pointing out some of the fine chocolates. And the chocolate that he pointed us to, these were handcrafted chocolates, and using the freshest ingredients and the most vibrant ingredients. And he pointed out there's also wonderful factory-made chocolate from Belgium. And then there's mass-produced chocolate, like you might see as a Hershey, but that middle-size, middle-quality chocolate, it's high quality, but not of this style of the handcrafted. And as you look in these tins, that one tin looks like it's 44 euros. Another one looks like 19 euros for a dozen pieces of chocolate. So this can be pricey, but it's very, very, very good quality. The one with the dachshund on the left, that looks like it's 60 euros for that size, which might be a pound and a half. We did buy some of that chocolate, and in the fall, around the holiday season, Costco sells some Belgian chocolate is one of the things that they offer. So you can stock up on Belgian chocolate. On the next day, we took our boat to Ghent, and this is another beautiful medieval town. But we were there not to visit Ghent, although some people went there late in the afternoon. We were there because we wanted to go to Bruges. And Bruges is the town, it's a wonderful town. And this was a major trading hub in 600 years ago. So in the 1400s, ships would come here from the North Sea. They would unload their cargo, and then it would be loaded onto smaller ships and sent to other parts of Europe. And so because they were the trading hub for all this merchandise, they became a very rich town because they collected 15 or 20% of the value of all of these transactions. And so it was a very wealthy town. But then in the 1600s, the access to the North Sea for large ships was blocked because the river silted up. And so here we have this magnificent, rich town with beautiful buildings that was basically frozen in time. So the population declined, the big building that was for the transfer of materials, it fell apart, but the buildings, the housing and the warehouses remain. And so back in the 1600s, this was a town equal to London in population and in wealth. But then it just stopped in time until it was rediscovered in the middle 1800s and late 1800s by British tourists. So if you were a British tourist going to Paris, people would say, oh, you should stop at Bruges on the way to Paris. And so this became a must-see for the newly emerging tourists from France and from England. And we were there on a beautifully clear day. You just see all the canals throughout the city. Here is one picture of the central plaza, and the building on the left was the administrative, the city hall. That tall building with the clock tower, it really had no purpose other than to be a bell tower and to show how wealthy the town was, that they could afford to build this as part of their city hall complex. Here's another picture from the market square. And these are buildings that date back to the 1300s. Just incredible. Now, we were there actually on a cold day. So this was probably April 3rd or 4th. And if you look in the picture on the left, it was a sunny day, so people wanted to be out, but they're wearing their winter coats. And Mary, and the picture on the right, Mary and I stopped in at a hot chocolate bar. And it was a wonderful experience because the staff, you paid and you received this mug of boiling hot milk. And then you selected the chocolate of your choice. And Mary has a stick with milk chocolate. I actually selected dark chocolate. So you swirl that stick around in the boiling milk, and a minute and a half later, you have wonderful hot chocolate. But more importantly, we were sitting in a warm spot. So Mary has her winter coat on, and you notice she has her rain slicker with her as well to stay warm, somewhat warm on a cold day. The church, we also visited. By this time, we were no longer with the tour. We were just walking on our own. But we visited the Church of Our Lady, which is the local basilica. And much as that church had that wonderful clock tower, a wealthy town wanted to show their wealth by having a magnificent church. And it's very beautiful. They have a museum part, and then they have actually the church part that you can go into free. you pay to go into the museum, but the museum had wonderful artwork. And one of the things that we were looking for that had been discussed in the lecture the night before was a sculpture by Michelangelo called Madonna and Child. And this is just a wonderful story. Michelangelo, a young Michelangelo, perhaps 24 years old, received a commission from a family in Rome that wanted a statue for their home. And he went off and created this statue of Mary and Jesus. And he brought it to the family, and they said, well, we don't want it, and we're not going to pay you. They said, in the meantime, since we gave you the commission, our nephew has been elected Pope. So we don't want a statue from an unknown young artist. We're going to go to a famous artist because now we're such an important family. So Michelangelo, took the statue away and found another buyer, and eventually it wound up in Bruges at the cathedral. And during World War II, the Germans, the Nazis, took the statue as they did for much art around Europe, and they took it to Germany. And it wound up in hidden in a mine in Austria, and along with tens of thousands of other works of art. And the US Army, as they were moving across Europe, they created a group of soldiers that they called the Monument Men, to go to try to find and recover lost artwork. And this is covered in the movie, The Monument Men. And the US soldiers actually found the mine, and they found the statue, and resulted in bringing it back to Bruges. So it's a happy ending for this particular work of art, although much art was never recovered from the looting of the Nazis. The day 6, we were visiting the windmill area of Holland, of the Netherlands, and this is called the Dyke area. And it's a national park. They have 19 windmills from the 1700s. And the windmills were actually, most of the windmills in the Netherlands were used to pump water, not to grind corn or wheat. They were used to move water. So these 19 windmills worked in tandem to raise the water level, raise water up maybe a foot or 8 inches per windmill, until it could finally be moved over into the large canal that was at sea level. So what we have here in this water here, this is actually probably 6 feet below sea level. Sea level, our boat was actually sitting to the left of this walkway, and we walked down the walkway and got over to the windmills. But the windmills actually were part of the pumping water that could go over the dike and then off to the North Sea. And that kept the land around the windmills free of water, so that they could actually grow crops. And here we see a windmill. This actually dates back to the 1736, this windmill. So, over 300, almost 300 years old. And the picture on the right is the woman that's the windmill operator, and she's pushing a wheel with her foot. And every time she pushes that wheel a half revolution, the windmill, the sail of the windmill actually moves a couple degrees, so that she could move it so it's optimizing collecting the wind. If in Holland, Michigan, there was actually one of these real windmills from this time period, that Holland, Michigan, which has many people that came from the Netherlands, they were very helpful to the Netherlands after World War II, and they asked the Netherlands government, could they buy a windmill, and for Holland, Michigan, and the Netherlands government, these are tightly controlled, these are part of their national heritage, but they did agree, provided that the Holland, Michigan paid to disassemble the windmill brick by brick, and build it exactly as it was sitting in the Netherlands, and that they send somebody to the Holland to become an official windmill operator, which Holland, Michigan did. So here we have a photograph of some of these windmills. People actually live in them now, and you can live here with modest rent, but you have to agree to be there on the weekend to have it open for visitors, because it's really part of a national park. But back in the 1800s, there were 10,000 windmills in the Netherlands, and oftentimes a husband and wife and 10 or 12 children lived in the windmill. And if you go to Holland, Michigan, you can see how small these are inside because of all the mechanics, and the living space was very, very limited. But back then it was a hard time economically, and people had to make do. Here we see by the 1900s, the electric pumps took over most of the pumping of water. And here we have, this was from the 1900s version of the water pumps. And the actual windmills dropped from 10,000 down to under 1,000. And the government wants to keep those 900 windmills as part of their heritage. But this was an electric pump. And when we had a little tour of the pumping house, and this was actually out of commission now. It's just there for historic purposes because they have a new modern, even more modern, more efficient pumping system. But the guide explained that after World War II, or at the end of World War II, the Germans destroyed the pumps like this, most of the pumps like this, or damaged them, so that the land was at great risk of flooding. But the US Army Corps of Engineers came in with some diesel water pumps that helped dry the land. And even when the Corps of Engineers went back to the US, they left 4 of these large diesel powered pumps behind for the Dutch, and so that they could, until they could reactivate their own pumps, they were able to use the American pumps that the Corps of Engineers left. So they were very grateful for that. The day 7, we went off to an area called the Zeeland area. And this is an area that is very prone to flooding because it's directly facing the North Sea. And even more important than facing the North Sea, the North Sea really narrows drastically at this portion. And so if you look at the picture on the right, you see on the left in white, the white is land. So Groot Britain, that's Great Britain, and Nederland is Netherlands. You see Belgium and Frankenkirk, that's France. But you see how the North Sea narrows. So if there's a major storm and high winds from the north, all that water is rushing down, and it can't, there's a bottleneck where where England and France, where they're only 19 miles apart. So all the water wants to rush into the Zeeland area. And back in 1953, with a huge storm and high winds and rain, the dike was breached in this area. And so the North Sea, the dike broke, and the 600 square miles of farmland flooded. 2,000 people lost their lives. It was, a natural disaster. And once a dike breaks, and I, in my naivety, I thought a dike was like a big stone wall. But a dike is actually made of clay and dirt. So it might be, a dike might be 60 yards wide and 20 yards high, 20 feet high, 30 feet high. And so that is what the dike looks like in the Netherlands. And the water flowed over the dike and then corrupted the dike from the backside, and that's what caused it to wash away. And so once a dike washes away, it's very difficult to rebuild a dike. But what they came up with, the the people in the Netherlands remembered in World War II, the Allies created these large cement floating docks that they brought to the Normandy beaches as part of D-Day. And they called Great Britain and said, do you have any of those left? And it turned out Great Britain did have some left and were willing to sell them to the Netherlands. And they floated 6 of these or 7 of these across from England. Several of them sank on the way because they tipped, and even though they float, if they still can capsize, but they did have enough that came across. And this picture, this is a picture in their museum. It shows them positioning these large cement floating docks to close the breach. And here we see these 4 big cement blocks that were used to close the dike partially, and then they brought more and more dirt and clay around it till they eventually totally closed off the breach. And so it was a major effort. Fortunately, it was successful. Now, it was so successful, they had these cement blocks, and a few years later, they said, well, what should we do with it? And they created a museum inside the blocks. And this was the Flood Museum that we visited. And this is actually one of these floating cement blocks that you see with a door. And this is actually just the top half of the floating block. It actually goes much lower underground. And here we are inside, walking inside the cement block. And this museum tells the story of the Great Flood and of the breaching of the dike. And one of the things they highlight, and this is part of education that they bring school kids, is telling the need for you as a family have to have food and water in your attic for 3 days, that you're not going to be rescued on the first or second day. You have to be able to live during a flood situation. Even if the lower part of your house is flooded, you have to live in your attic until you're rescued on the 3rd day. And on the 3rd day, you can start opening up the window on your attic and raise a white flag that indicates somebody is inside that needs rescuing. And I thought that was very ingenious, but this is part of realizing that you live in a flood-prone, flood risk area, and you have to be responsible for your life. You can't expect immediate rescue. The Netherlands did launch a project called the Delta Project to control parts of the North Sea. And they spent $13 billion to create a mechanism that they could lower these gates to block a storm on the North Sea from flooding this area, so that fish can still come in and fishermen can live here, and yet they can still block the North Sea from a bad storm. So that was the major part of our trip. Now, the last full day on the boat, we actually went to the Keukenhof Tulip Festival. And this, we took a bus from our ship. We were back in Amsterdam, but they put us on a bus and we went out like a 20-mile journey. And this is the world's largest tulip festival. And the week that we were on the ship, we kept asking the staff, will the tulips be in bloom at the festival? And the crew knew that they would be, but they were very cagey. They wanted to keep us in suspense, and they'd say, we certainly hope so. It turned out they knew they were, and it was wonderful, a wonderful experience. So this is the Tulip Festival is held on the grounds. It's 80 acres, so it's pretty close to the size of our Botanic Gardens. If you exclude some parts of I'm not sure how big the Botanic Gardens is, but this 80 acres, it's totally occupied with tulips. And there are some other flowers as well, but it focuses 7 million tulip bulbs. it's only open 6 weeks of the year. So all the major tulip farmers and operations provide tulips for the festival. And I think they probably provide the labor to plant them. So, I don't know the whole business side, but it's a cooperative effort between the organization, the festival, and the tulip growers. And everywhere you turn, it's one site more beautiful than the next. It's just incredible. The picture on the right is of a Zen garden area. Here we have, there's me with one of the hostesses, one of the princesses for the tulips. On the right, those are not tulips, but they're just another wonderfully beautiful flowers. Up to 50,000 people a day come to the festival. So we were there on a bus, and there had to be 200 buses. Everywhere you turn, there was bus, let alone people that drove their cars here. I love that picture of that child. More colorful. There are some permanent buildings, as we see on that left picture, and they have displays and restaurants, so that you can spend time with a lecture or a guidance on how to grow your tulips and display them. There's Mary in front of a hut that sells tulips, and Europeans can buy these tulips and bring them home. My understanding is that we can't, we can buy tulips that come from Canada or from the US, but we can't bring tulips from Europe back here, is what I understand. But look at, that's I believe that is a cherry tree, but what a wonderful photo op. Here's on the picture on the right, the woman pedaling the bike. It looks like she's pedaling it. That's a stationary bike, but it's a wonderful photo op. And these are some of the tulip displays inside. And they're just wonderful, wonderful displays. Now, that was the end of our trip. We got off the boat on I think it was a Sunday morning when the boat docked, where we were done. They actually had docked the day before we went to the Tulip Festival, but Sunday morning was our time to leave the boat. And what I found interesting is the vast majority of the 180 people on the ship, they had flown into Amsterdam. They were picked up by a bus from the Viking group. They took them to the ship. At the end of the trip, they got back on a bus and went back to the airport and flew home. Mary and I actually flew off to London and spent 4 or 5 days in London. We figure it's a hassle to fly to Europe. As long as you're there, why not spend a little more time? But most of the people hopped right back on and went to the airport, even though the vast majority of people on the ship were retired. Almost everyone was 60 years old or older. There were a couple, we saw a couple, there might have been 20 people under 50, 15 or 20 under 50. The vast majority were over 60. So that is the trip we took, and I'd love to answer any questions. Christina, what would be the process for questions or comments?
Hi. Oh, great. Okay, so if everyone could type questions that they have for Jean into the chat or the Q&A, either way, I will see them. So I just sent out a quick reminder to you guys to type your questions for Jean into the chat. And I actually have a question for Jean. So my mother has talked about Viking cruises, river cruises for such a long time. She really wants to go on one. So I just wanted to know a little bit more about your experience on the cruise. I assume that you ate most of your meals there, right? And you slept there.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. And there are many cruise lines, and we had a wonderful experience with Viking. And the vast majority of people that we talked to this was our first time on a Viking cruise, but most of the people that we talked to this was their second, third, fourth, or eighth Viking cruise. So
Oh,
people really, they have a huge repeat, and they offer special deals for their past members or past travelers.
oh, nice.
But they do there are some river cruise companies that are less expensive.
Mm-hmm.
But Viking really did it well. And one example that I had for that is when we took the bus to Bruges from, the ship was, we had to take a bus to get to Bruges. And Bruges, the bus drops people off about a mile from the central Bruges. So you had to walk a mile to get to that central area. And my wife, Mary, she has some mobility issues, but Viking asked, the people that have mobility issues, they arrange for 7 or 8 taxis to be there at the bus stop to take us to central Bruges, so that we did not have to walk a mile or a mile and a half to get to where we started the tour. They had a taxi that took us right there. It's not a huge thing, but I think the low-cost river cruise people probably say, good luck walking that mile.
Oh.
That's you're responsible for that. Viking they went out of their way to be extra nice at every turn.
Well, you know what? That sounds so great, because that's exactly my mother's problem. Is she'll have some mobility issues, and the walking, that's difficult. So that's so nice that they offer that.
Absolutely.
I'm sure it's worth the price.
Absolutely. And there are other wonderful. I'm sure there are some very good ones too. But I think talking to people that have had that experience with the company you're considering is the best proof point for how happy they were.
Yeah. So speaking of which, since you got so many good reviews, are you and Mary planning another Viking cruise sometime in the future?
We're planning that. We were going to be on a cruise last year on not a Viking cruise. It was going to be a cruise, I think, on Norwegian line. We were going to the western part of Norway from Copenhagen, but that all got canceled because of the pandemic.
Yeah. So no vacation plans for you guys then?
Not yet. Okay. But the 2021 will be a great one. Here.
All right. So we actually got a question in our Q&A, Jean.
Oh, yes. What's the question?
So how many days was your trip, and how long was the flight there?
Okay, so we flew directly to Amsterdam, which was I think a 9 or 10 hour flight.
Mm-hmm.
And the river cruise part was 9 days.
Okay.
And so we were there for 9 days, and we got to Amsterdam 3 days early. We were there 3 days early, and then at the end of the trip, we went off to London for 4 days.
Oh, nice. Yeah, that's really great to take advantage of being in Europe anyway, right?
Absolutely.
All right. And so that person also wanted to say, wonderful talk, very interesting. Thank you for your presentation and for the library for sponsoring. You're welcome, Bonnie. All right. And then we have another question or comment. I was on 2 Viking river cruises, first from Budapest to Amsterdam. Cool. And from Amsterdam to Basel. We saw the Floriade, I think that's how you say it, Floriade, which occurs only every 10 years. Next one is in 2022. Oh, nice.
Wow.
Some excellent memories. Thank you. Okay, here's the question. Did you stop at Rudesheim, Germany?
No, we actually never got onto the Rhine. We were on the rivers in the canals within Netherlands and Belgium. And one of the things that really surprised me is how big these canals were. I expected the canals to be maybe 20 or 30 yards wide. Some of these canals were 50 and 60 and 70 yards wide or wider.
Wow.
In some areas, they got narrow, particularly as you got to a lock. But some of these canals and rivers were much larger than I expected.
Oh, wow. So we have another question in the chat. Are the shore excursions included in the cruise price? Cruises I've been on, you pay extra for the shore excursions. Where did you stay in Amsterdam before the cruise? Wonderful presentation.
Oh, thank you. Unlike some of the big ship cruises, like in the Caribbean, on a river cruise, every day there is one included excursion, and so that's built into the price, and it's oftentimes you get to pick of A or B.
Oh,
But one is included, and then you could take a second excursion the same day, and that you'd have to pay for the second one, but one is always included.
oh, nice. That's really great to know.
And then for the second question, the people that most of the people worked with actually Viking to plan their airline, and then oftentimes they planned a hotel that Viking included in the package, or they paid for the hotel. We actually stayed at a little hotel right near the train station in Amsterdam.
Okay.
So we kind of follow a lot of the advice of Rick Steves of staying close to the train station, because that's where the trams and the public transportation exists. So we were not in a 4-star hotel. We were probably in a 2-star hotel, but it was very convenient to seeing around Amsterdam for those 3 days on our own.
Nice. That's a good Rick Steves tip for you.
Yes,
Stay
yes.
near transportation. All right. So we have one more comment. We did Rhine, Rhone, and Danube. First time and only one next time, but both stopped in Rudesheim. They have
Okay.
a music box museum, and a Schaumburg, Illinois man fixes them for him. Wow, that's an interesting connection
Very
to
good.
Illinois. All
No,
right, well,
and the Rhine is a wonderful, there's wonderful river cruises on the Rhine and the Danube. So those would be excellent for people to consider as well.
nice. Well, I'm going to have to talk to my mother about future river cruise plans. All right. And so she just wants to follow up and says, thanks, great presentation. And one more quick question. When you went on your trip in 2019, what month did you take your trip in?
Well, so it was in March. We left in late March because that is the beginning of the tulip season. So this was actually called the Tulip trip by Viking. So that would be April and maybe early May. Then they call it something else. After that, if people are still basically going to the same spots, but
Yeah.
the Tulip Festival is over by mid-May. The Tulip Festival is over.
Right. So that makes sense. So you can still take your Viking cruise, but at another time of year, it won't be tulip centric.
That's right. That's
Okay.
right.
Well, thank you so much. This was so informative. Oh gosh, it makes me really want to travel, and I
Well,
can't wait until we can all get out and
We
get
can
around.
all get out there. Let's start planning for 2022.
Yeah, let's be positive. All right. Thanks so much, Jean. It was great to have you back again.
Thank you, Christina. Thank you, and thank you, the library.
All right. You're welcome. All right, everybody. Take care. Thanks for joining us tonight.